Alright guys, today we are talking about Egypt, specifically pre-dynastic Egypt, and then how it transforms into the Old Kingdom. And then we'll look at the Middle and New Kingdom in the next lecture. So I wanted to start with this timeline, just to give you an idea of where we're at, because it sometimes can be confusing if the way that we're doing things, we're looking at individual societies and we're kind of moving forward in time, and then we go back in time to look at it in another society. So it isn't that we finished with Mesopotamia, right? We looked at all of these, right? We looked at Sumer, we looked at Ur, Akkad, Babylon, and then we looked at Assyria, right? So we got to over here with Assyria, and then we'll address Neo-Babylonia when we actually talk about the Persians, the Medes and Persians. But so we got pretty far on this timeline. Right here's Persia. And then what we're doing now is we're going back to the start, and we're starting with Egypt. And so I just don't want you to think like Mesopotamia happened, all of that happened, and then Egypt happened. These things were going on simultaneously. And this will happen again when we talk about India and then China as well, right? That we're going forward in time, and then we're going back in time to look at the next society, which I do intentionally just because I think it's more succinct in being able to understand the individual cultures than trying to talk about everything that's exactly happening, where I would be talking about Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China all in the same lecture, but you're only getting parts of it, and then you're moving on the next lecture to looking at the different period in time, and you're talking about all four again. It gets convoluted, especially if you don't understand the cultures. If you already understand the cultures, that way works. That method is good to see the connections. And I'm gonna reference Mesopotamia. So just because we finish Mesopotamia doesn't mean we're done with Mesopotamia, because it's gonna come back up. I'm gonna ask you to compare and contrast Mesopotamia and Egypt. I'm gonna ask you to compare and contrast looking at Egypt and China, and India and Mesopotamia, all, and the different things and how they had differences and similarities, if there was interaction between the groups. So we add to that part of kind of looking at what's going on all at the same time. But I think that if you don't have a foundation of these societies, doing it the other way is difficult. So instead, we looked at Mesopotamia, we looked at Assyria. Now we're going back in time, and we're looking at Egypt, which is going to start with the early dynastic and then the Old Kingdom today. So that's what we're looking at today. And then in the next lecture, we're going to look at the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom period. So if you can see on the timeline, right, as far as start times, Mesopotamia just barely beat out Egypt and as the first civilization, as much as that matters. But they ultimately were interacting around the same time frame. The other thing I wanted to mention is just the difference in, I think, popular culture with Egypt, which is where we get to this. And I know this is somewhat dating me now from when these came out, but the things I kind of think about are TV shows and movies that showcase Egypt. And there's still new ones that come out all the time. These were just kind of big ones back in the day. You had Stargate, and then you had the Mummy series, right? And so that Egypt has captured the populace's attention more than Mesopotamia does. We don't have a lot of movies or various aspects of popular culture. For example, there was a whole Lego series on Egypt, but it definitely featured the kind of similar themes that popular culture latched onto. And so, why is it that we have this kind of popular culture references in movies that seem to like to reference Egypt over, Mesopotamia and some of the others? Well, let's look at that for just a second on popular culture themes or references, and think about what are the things that if you don't know much about Egypt historically, do you think about? And of course, the mummy, and not just the movie, but the idea of a mummy. I think pyramids, there tends to be something with treasure, right? And that can lead to, for example, the Lego set. It was, you had a pyramid and a sphinx, and then you had I think they called the person an archaeologist, but he totally looked like a tomb raider with his supplies, which you could argue some of the earliest archaeologists kind of functioned more as tomb raiders than scientists, in that they often took a lot of Egyptian goods back with them, some with permission and quite a lot without, which is what led eventually to Egypt cracking down on cultural antiquities being removed from Egypt, which is why to this day it's harder to get little artifacts to show you. But the mummy, pyramids, this tends to then go to this idea of magic, right? If you look at the movies, there's magic spells, they say, that bring the mummies back to life. And that, where this all gets rooted in certain things. And then I think also you have the Alien, which is the Stargate movie and TV series theme as well, right? Oh, the pyramids weren't built by humans, they were built by aliens. In the Stargate movie and TV show, the pyramids were spaceships, and the Egyptian gods were the aliens, the Goa'uld. And then in the movies, right, it's that there's adventures going on. And the pyramids often have that there's lots of traps and curses, right? So, okay, why did this kind of attract our attention in popular culture in ways that, Mesopotamia didn't? One, the physical presence of the pyramids. They're still there. The city of Babylon and Babylonia, and then even later Neo-Babylonia, that had one of the 7 wonders of the ancient worlds, the Hanging Gardens. And the gates of Ishtar, the whole building was amazing. The walls were very large, and the top part of the walls, they usually in kind of older times made walls to have where soldiers could walk across the top, because then you could set up archers for defense. But these walls were so wide at the top where people walked across that 2 chariots could pass each other with enough space. So, which is very impressive for the time. This was quite an amazing feat. In fact, before Saddam Hussein was killed and removed from power, he was actually trying to recreate at a smaller scale the city of Babylon, specifically the walls, and make it like a tourist attraction. But it's that concept of right, something physical being there. A lot of Mesopotamia, it doesn't have the physical remnants left over, or they're just the tells, which are tells are kind of like hills, where the mounds are not natural, right? That this what looks like, it just looks like a hill to a naked eye, but it's made up from different levels of archaeological whatever's left, and then the different levels are it goes from newer to older, and what you can find are the remnants of artifacts in that, right? So here we'll put artifacts here. But this is not very exciting, right? To just look at a mound and go, ooh, there used to be buildings there. Now there's just leftovers. That is exciting for archaeologists and historians to be able to reconstruct and understand how does society live. But for the average person looking at it, it's like, yay, thank you, I guess. But you have the pyramids and the Sphinx, they're still physically there. And they may have deteriorated and been stolen from over time, but they're still massive and imposing as is. And then you attach that to King Tut's tomb, and finding a tomb that was intact with all of that wealth and splendor, because the Egyptians had such an elaborate burial process for the pharaohs, which the Mesopotamians did not. That ultimately that then leads into the intrigue of not just the pyramids, but the idea that maybe there was traps and that there were curses, because there was a curse written on King Tut's entryway. But not necessarily the belief that it activated if you went in. But of course, that spreads with that interest with the actual archaeologists and people with King Tut. After they published the curse and the findings, what happened is that some of those that were involved on the expedition started dying. And so then the newspapers picked this up, in the 1900s, talking about how the curse of King Tut was alive and active, right? So it sparks our imagination. And then, of course, the mummies, the whole burial process of mummification is unique and sparks imagination. And then the incantations and spells we're going to look at, the pyramid text, they did have, but they weren't used to bring a physical mummy back to life in the current world. Those incantations and spells were used for the Ba and Ka, the spirit, to go travel to the afterlife. It brought it to life in the afterlife. So it all of our kind of popular culture interest in the Egyptian stories and ideas come from things that actually are there, but then, made in Hollywood fashion to sound more interesting. But it definitely, I think that physical presence of the pyramids has helped capture that imagination far more than when you don't have something, grand. And just the fact that for many people it was unfathomable how someone so long ago could have created such massive structures. And we'll see the Mayans, the Aztecs, they were creating amazing structures, the China and the Great Wall. It really, if you look through history, there are cultures all over the place creating magnificent works. Way before, the Greeks and Romans were doing it, where we apparently decide that at that point in history, that's acceptable for that technology. But anything prior to that, oh, that's impossible. They couldn't have done it. It must have been aliens. Yeah. So just be aware, right, that those things in popular culture are coming from specific aspects of Egyptian history, but then, have a more interesting bent, I suppose, or fantastical bent to it. But I definitely think it's that physical presence that provides that catalyst for interest, and then just the unique idea of anything where there's hordes of riches and wealth are going to, and the fact that Egypt was so wealthy creates a type of interest. And even throughout history, the Romans were fascinated by the Egyptians. So Egypt hadn't lost its appeal and interest just from the Old Kingdom, right? You had ancient societies like the Romans being fascinated by Egypt as well. So it obviously has long held an appeal and pull to people. All right, the first part that we're going to look at is pre-dynastic Egypt. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because ultimately their development was very similar to Mesopotamia. If you're looking at, they started out in very much the same ways. You have hunting and gathering societies, and they functioned in the same way with men and women. That wherever you go, hunting and gathering societies, that they're going to be the same. One of the things that was different in the area when they settled down is that you have the Nile River, and we'll talk about the Nile River a little bit more in a minute, but that ultimately this and the Nile Delta created the prime real estate for rich agricultural land. And you didn't have to fight or even innovate technologically to use this as a resource, which of course eventually leads that to agriculture. And in fact, they had a little bit of an easier time with transitioning to agriculture because of that fact that they didn't have to innovate to be successful. One of the things that we'll see with that is it does create a sense in Egypt of everything, them being adverse to change. The Egyptians were not good with change. The Mesopotamians were like killer with it because they had to do it to survive. Egypt was like, oh, we've been living like this successfully for so long. Why do we have to change now? And they feared it almost to a degree and were very resistant to it, which we'll see when we look, especially not so much in the Old Kingdom because things were pretty static, but like when you get to the New Kingdom, they were very resistant to change to the Middle Kingdom and the intermediate periods because of that kind of ease of which they had been able to live it. Their geography had not forced them to be innovative. And we'll see other places like China, they had to be innovative to to really utilize the way that they wanted the rivers. And so depending on societies where you have this requirement to be innovative to be successful versus not, can influence and impact how the society develops. And then from here, right, what do you get? You get independent towns and groups. So they had independent, they weren't fully developed city-states, more towns, and this then led to the slow development of two kingdoms. One of the things that we'll see is that Egypt is going to unify a lot easier than Mesopotamia. They had independent towns, but there wasn't a lot of objection when you had a king that ended up proclaiming that they were king over Upper or Lower Egypt. And so there were two kingdoms. There was Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And this was the main structure, political structure for a while. If you look at Egypt, if you think of it as like, we'll just do the Nile as the aspect. So if here's the delta at the top, right? And then you have the Nile that goes down. This is Lower Egypt. It's the opposite of what you think, right? And I think that's just because of thinking, up is up. Upper is the lower part. So Upper Egypt was what was closer to what was called Nubia, or the rest of Africa. And then, so this is Egypt here for both of these, right? I'll put the arrow because that might be confusing. All right, so here we have Egypt, and it was broken into Upper and Lower Egypt for the two kingdoms, and then Nubia was down that way. Why this is Lower Egypt? Because this is based on the flow of the river, right? The river flows that way, so starts up and goes down. Thus, Lower Egypt is where the delta, the Nile Delta was, and then starts down here within Nubia, and you have some cataract stuff. We'll talk more about that in a minute with the map. But so that's why it's labeled as that. That's how it was determined, Lower and Upper Egypt. And so you had two kings that were of those two regions. And part of this is really this idea that Egypt from the beginning was more homogeneous, which means similar or alike. You had Mesopotamia where they were more independent city-states that identified from their city-state outside of being Mesopotamian, which is why it took until Sargon to unify them. And even then there was conflict and rebellion and revolt at times because people identified often more as separate kings. Even the kings, right? You have Sargon, you have the Akkadian Empire, you have the third dynasty of Ur, you have the Babylonian Empire. Their empires are named by the city-state that takes over. In Egypt, right, you have two Upper and Lower Egypt, and then you're going to have Egypt as a whole, unified Egypt. And people don't challenge this. The towns didn't go, but I'm from this town, I'm from Cush, and so, I'm from Thebes, and we're Thebes first, and Egyptian second. It was always Egyptian first, and everything else fell after that. And part of that, what was that homogeneous aspect, was the fact that the Nile unified. The Nile was a unifying force of Egypt because it was used not only for farming and fishing, but travel. People constantly traveled on it, way more than the Tigris and the Euphrates, because it was so calm and predictable. And so you were able to transmit culture and information and identity through all of Egypt so that they identified as a whole rather than as individual towns that were somewhat isolated from other groups unless someone worked really hard to get there. So the Nile plays this whole role. We'll look at with some of their philosophy and structure, but even just their identity as Egyptians is coming from this. So while there was a conflict and fight between the king of Upper Egypt and the king of Lower Egypt, we'll put that here. Once there is a unified Egypt, people don't resist it. And it doesn't change. Egypt then strives to stay unified, and only outside forces disrupt that. There are not internal forces changing the unified nature of Egypt or trying to move it back to two kingdoms. So what happens when you get a unified Egypt was that, like I said, it was a fight between the two kings, the two kingdoms. And we don't have a lot about what happened with that. What we do have with it is they believe that the king that wins was King Menes. And that it's connected to the Narmer Palette. And actually, I'm going to skip to that on the PowerPoint to look at here. And it's believed that the Narmer Palette, then what it shows is it depicts the conflict and unification of Egypt. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that and what it's showing, and then we'll look at the general characteristics. So I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to come back to these here in just a minute. I guess I probably should have put these two first. So this is a Narmer Palette. It's two-sided, and what you see is the King Menes, or Narmer, they think the name was synonymous, fighting. And here, you have, they had hierarchical scale in Egypt. So if you notice, look at how much larger the king is from everyone else. That's hierarchical scale. And it's done intentionally because the king they become pharaohs, which Pharaoh, I'm going to use Pharaoh. Pharaoh's technically a term that's used later, but it just basically means king anyway. We're going to use Pharaoh after this part right here to make it clear between like Mesopotamia and others. So the Pharaoh is what we're going to call all of the Egyptian kings, whether that term was technically being used at that time period or not, because it does become the main terminology in Egypt. So the king here, though, right, he's much larger, and later when they depict it with pharaohs, it's done as well, and we'll look at the role of the pharaoh and why they did this. Usually hierarchical scale is not just used to show that person has a greater importance, but it often is connected to religious ideas as well. But anytime you see someone in art, and we looked at this with Naram Sin, right, where they're displayed as large or significantly larger than other people, that should take your notice and go, why? Okay, that person's important, or they're trying to show that they're important. What is that? What is that saying, right? Why is it that they're so much larger than everyone else? What is the significance of that? Is it a religious connection? Does it have to do with their power? And it reinforces all of that stuff. So you have on this side, right, there's fighting and death. You have the club that he's holding to deal the death blow. And in each one of these, you have the god following the king to show not only the justification of him taking over, but the god's connection to that. And then at the end here, you have those mythical creatures, which again, they're kind of connecting together, intertwining, and it's suggesting unification. The other aspect that shows this unification are the crowns or helmets. So there were two crowns, the crown of Upper Egypt and the crown of Lower Egypt. When Egypt unified, when the pharaohs were coronated, they were then crowned with they just put them together, right? The dual crown of Egypt, the unified crown of Egypt. And so here actually showcases that ceremony where you had priestesses that would wear the crowns of each Upper and Lower Egypt, and then the pharaoh being crowned to represent that he ruled over a unified Egypt. So that was also a way of time period of showcasing that unification of the transition of starting and wearing both crowns. And then, like I said, the fighting to show that they fought to unify and that the god was behind him supporting, and then ultimately the unification of that. Okay, so after that, you have the Old Kingdom. But before we get into the specifics of the Old Kingdom, I want to look at some kind of general characteristics of Egypt that are present in the Old Kingdom, but these some of them are going to stay more than others. So this is the Old Kingdom. I'll put it here. We'll do 2. Oh, if it wants to work there. We'll do Old Kingdom here, but we're going to start with some general characteristics that can also apply to, various periods in Egypt. Like some of these continue on past the Old Kingdom. And then we'll look at some of the aspects that are very much just Old Kingdom. So the first is that Egypt as an island. Now, I'm going to clarify what I mean here with this, because Egypt was not an actual island, right? This means in terms of protection, that Egypt is going to be protected based on geography, and that is going, so it functions like it would if they had been an island. They were not isolated in the same way islands were in the ancient world, but they had these 3 geographical barriers that really protected Egypt and helped shape its outlook into a much more positive and secure outlook and society than Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia didn't have natural barriers and borders to protect them in the same way Egypt did. So you have 3, and we'll look at them. I'll write them and then we'll show them on the map. You had the seas, you had the desert, and then you had the Nile. And these 3 then create that geographical barrier that form that sense of protection to create a sense of stability, right? What this ultimately does is it creates stability and peace. And that definitely then is going to impact their outlook in a much more positive manner. So if we look at the map, right, you have the seas here, lots and lots of desert there, desert here. And then what I mean by the Nile is that right before Nubia, there were cataracts, which were like large boulders and waterfall areas that prevented an army from straight sailing down the Nile straight into the heart of Egypt. You would have had to, so if you were sailing on it and then you got to the cataracts, you'd have to get off all your boats, you'd have to carry your boats, and this was a big enough section around the cataracts to get back into the water. It was not practical to do at all. If this wasn't here, you could have had smaller canoes and boats that could have sailed straight into Egypt. So you have the Nile through the cataracts provides a specific barrier. The desert, no armies walking through the desert right here. The one area where they could, that's small enough that it's easy enough to protect that barrier. And then and this is important because this will change in the Old Kingdom and part of the Middle Kingdom, but especially the Old. But like I said, even in the Middle Kingdom, the technology wasn't there. For the technology of sailing in boats, there were small things you could do, but to be able to transport through the seas a massive military force to invade, that technology was not really possible in the Old Kingdom and was still difficult in the Middle Kingdom. By the New Kingdom, that barrier is gone. They lose a lot of that kind of protection as an island thing by the New Kingdom, and we'll see how that becomes clear. But this phase, and like I said, the unified phase through Old and part of the Middle Kingdom, you have these 3 locations that essentially create a bubble around Egypt so that they aren't invaded. Egypt was almost never invaded in the Old Kingdom, and even when there were small things, it was not very large forces, and it wasn't until the first intermediate period that anyone's successful. So that's hundreds and hundreds of years of stability and a lack of concern and fear from invasion that Mesopotamia never got. And so it's not surprising that that should create a sense of stability and security that others didn't. Since I mentioned that, let's look at, I put the Old Kingdom here, but there's several periods that define Egypt. And so I want to make sure those are clear, since I'm talking about that. So we'll just do a break here from the list, right? The first one that you have is the Old Kingdom, right? And if we were actually looking before, not PY, you'd have the Pre-dynastic Egypt. Then you'd have Old Kingdom. Then you have what's called the First Intermediate Period. And this is when the Hittites, which were a group in the area, invaded Egypt. And during the First Intermediate Period and took control, Egypt was not in control by Egypt. So you had a whole 100+ year period where Egyptians were not ruling Egypt, right? The parts where Egypt were doing that, you have the old, well, technically, I guess we could put, pre-dynastic was the first, but if we're looking at unified, right, then you have the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom happens because Egyptians finally overthrow the Hittites and take back over. And then you have the Middle Kingdom for a while, and then you have the Second Intermediate Period. And here it's the Hyksos that take over, and control Egypt. So once again, during the Second Intermediate Period, Egypt is not in control. And then the New Kingdom signifies the start of when Egypt overthrows the Hyksos and takes back over. So you have the old, middle, and new, and how those are delineated is by these intermediate periods where foreigners controlled Egypt. And this is going to be fundamental to their sense of self, by the way. They're gonna have a crisis of identity, which we'll look at when we talk about the Middle Kingdom and then when we talk about the New Kingdom. Because you go for, imagine, hundreds and hundreds of years if you count pre-dynastic Egypt, where people weren't invading them. And then all of a sudden, and it wasn't all of a sudden, but it felt like all of a sudden to them, they're invaded and foreigners are ruling Egypt. And the Egyptians saw themselves as the center of the world. And so to them, it was just devastating that non-Egyptians were ruling Egypt. And so when they finally do take back over in the Middle Kingdom, you do have this crisis of self and this is going to be connected to the second part, which is Mot, and questioning their philosophy that they live by, which was Mot. Now, Mot is technically a goddess and a philosophy. We're going to look at it as a philosophy, so please, please, please don't reference it as a goddess in your answers and exams and things like that. If I ask for the definition, I'm saying, what is Mot in a term? It's not just a definition, by the way. We'll talk about that when it gets closer. But if I ask for the term Mot, I don't want you just saying, well, it was a goddess. That's so irrelevant to what we're talking about here. We're looking at the philosophy and how it shaped Egyptian society, because this became a central philosophy that they did. Oh, and so like I said, did I put stability and peace and order is the other one I wanted to put, right, for what this Egypt as an island provided. Okay, so for Mot is several things. Let's say for the definition, it's not just one thing. It's stability, it's truth, it's peace, it's justice and harmony and balance. It is also the idea that everything has its place in the world and is where it is supposed to be. And the gods established that. in you could say in a benevolent fashion, right? Because the gods were mostly seen as good in Egypt. So that's a lot, right? Stability, truth, peace, justice, harmony, balance. Everything has its place in the world, and it's the way that it's supposed to be because the gods established it as thus, in a benevolent way for the people. So you should see that when we look at the instructions or precepts of Ptahhotep, he talks about that in be happy with the place that your position you're in. Or that people below you are in the position they're in, and mocking them or showing off your stuff doesn't do any good, because this is the order of things and the way it's supposed to be, and you don't challenge that, and that's certainly then why it's part of their slow changing aspect, is that you don't challenge that system. So Mott structured a lot of their outlook and thinking on how to live. It was also central to their identity, right? In the Old Kingdom, let's say the 3 phases of Mott. Well, we're only going to look at one for this lecture, but it's good to know all of them right now. So for the Old Kingdom, it was that Mott was maintained. In the Middle Kingdom, it was that Mott was restored. So why does it change? Because of those intermediate periods. And in the New Kingdom, it was Mott was lost to the current world. And what they end up doing cleverly is that they move it to religion. And I'll explain that more when we look at it later. So that each intermediate period shattered Mott temporarily, right? In the Old Kingdom, the belief is Mott is maintained, right? It's present. And the Pharaoh's job was to keep it that way. So the Pharaoh's role was to maintain Mott, maintain it. Right? So, but this is the idea of maintaining means that it's present. It's there, it's active. And that's key to that. So the instant you have the intermediate period where the Hittites come in and take over, the belief was, well, that the whole balance, stability, you could add wisdom too. I didn't put that one in there, but wisdom sometimes gets attached to it as well. Balance, stability, wisdom, justice, harmony, all of these things that were there, truth, those things felt shattered, that possibly couldn't be present and maintained if foreigners had invaded and taken over. So which is why then it'll have to change in the Middle Kingdom to being restored, because it wasn't maintained anymore. It was lost, but then it was restored. But in the Old Kingdom, it's there. And the Pharaoh's going to play a role in each kingdom and how he responds, and is supposed to respond to Mott. Now, the next thing that actually reinforces this sum is the Nile. The Nile is central to Egypt. I mean, the statement goes, the Nile is Egypt, or the Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt, right? They knew how important the Nile was. The Nile was calm and predictable, right? Unlike the Tigris and the Euphrates, which was erratic and irregular and dangerous at times, you had a calm, predictable, stable. It created stability and peace. It was seen as this calming force. It also provided the wealth of Egypt, right? The agriculture was very wealthy because of the rich soil. And it was seen as this constant. This is also why I mentioned the aversion to change, right? You had this long-standing constant that just seemed to always be there. The Nilometers that they were able to actively predict how much the Nile was going to flood. So here's the goddess of Ma'at. This is the feather of Ma'at. If you see this, that tended to represent Ma'at. So you see the feather, that's Ma'at. So there is the goddess of Ma'at, but again, more often while we're looking at it, is not this way, but as a philosophy. Okay, so don't forget that. The Nile River, here you can see, right? Why is it Egypt? Well, everything else is desert. The lush greenery and agricultural rich soil is because of the Nile. If you didn't have the Nile, it would be desert. So these are Nile meters, and they measured the flooding of the Nile. This is the whole view. That was a zoomed in of one of them. And then you also had this gauge here. And so the waters would flood in, and then they could use the combination of these two things to accurately measure the flooding of the Nile. And because it was pretty consistent, and because they had kept records for so long, the scientists, they weren't call them scientists, but the people in charge of doing this could accurately predict each year when and how much the Nile was going to flood. So, I mean, that's a crazy kind of stability and knowledge that you're not afraid of the Nile. The Nile is this great thing that is seen as providing to you with such consistency and stability that it's not something to be feared, which isn't surprising then when it gets us into the hymn to the Nile, right? And the fact that they ended up seeing it as a god, and that they celebrated it, right? The hymn to the Nile, and we'll take a look at some of these again, looking at some of what I talked about and a few that I skipped over in the meetings. But it was a celebration of the Nile. If you compare it to the penitential prayer to every god in Mesopotamia, because those are very similar kind of literature genres. You get, those are the best two to compare. Hymn to the Nile and penitential prayer to every god. One, in Mesopotamia, right, the gods, he's being punished, he's afflicted. The gods, it talks about the gods' anger and wrath. He's hoping for mercy. But there's a lot of negative in that. And then you have the hymn to the Nile, which is this celebration and positive acknowledgement of the strength and power of the Nile. And while that if the Nile didn't want to provide, they would be in trouble. But there's no threat. It's all just this positive aspect of here's what you provide, here's how powerful you are, here's how we celebrate you. And yes, you could destroy us, but you don't. And it's not contingent upon us being afraid of you and hoping we don't piss you off. You just provide for us in the process. So that, like I said, the recognizing the power and the fact that it's a provider of Egypt and the people, and something to be happy and positive about. And then ultimately, right, that's going to establish the idea of the gods as positive. And then, so we're going to look at it in just a second. And one thing I want to connect, right? So if we're looking at the geography as an influence, right? Think about that you have the protection and stability through geographical barriers and the Nile, okay? And also wealth. So people weren't, which specifically you're think food, right? People were not hungry. People were protected. This then creates a sense of stability and peace. Right? And calm. Things are good, and wealth with that. And then this is reinforces the concept and philosophy of Ma'at. Right? So there's how you have that geographic connection, and also this sense of ultimately that everything's kind of slow changing, right? they don't adapt or evolve quickly in Egyptian society because they didn't have to for so long. I mean, that's ultimately part of it, is that they found themselves not having to adapt in order to survive, and so that then the cyclical nature of the Nile flooding and receding calmly just reinforces that slow changing nature. So let's take a look at the hymn to the Nile. I'm going to put the charger in real quick. All right, so we're going to look at the hymn to the Nile, and specifically kind of take a close look at some key areas that have to do with that reinforcement of Mot, and how that kind of shapes their view. But also, if we look at the questions, let's go back to the questions for a second. How did the Egyptians view the Nile according to the hymn of the Nile? And how was their outlook different from the Mesopotamians, and why? Again, a really good thing to do with question number 2 is compare it to the penitential prayer to every god. And what do you see there? And how does that compare to the hymn to the Nile, and the kind of the tone that's being used? But also just like, how are they responding to their god versus in the penitential prayer? What's the expectation of what the god's doing? How are the gods being portrayed? What's the overall outlook? Is it upbeat? Is it gloomy? Those type of things. Okay, so that for the first one, the first 2 questions go with hymn to the Nile. So from the very beginning, you should see that it's kind of this celebration, right? You have "Hail to thee, O Nile," and it's an exclamation point. This would have been done orally in a ritual. So they would have been saying this out loud. "Hail to thee, O Nile," but much louder. I'm not going to shout it. It's excitement, right? "Who manifests thyself over this land and comes to give life to Egypt." So right off the bat there, right, rather than saying, "May the gods be pacified, may the wrath and anger," here it's, "Hail to thee, O Nile, who manifests thyself over this land and gives life to Egypt," right? Watering the orchards of Ra. And I pointed this out before in the meeting, but for those who forgot or were not there, they're going to list several gods here. So watering the orchards created by Ra, cause all the cattle to live. You give the earth to drink, inexhaustible one. Then the path that descends from the sky, loving the bread of Seb and the first fruits of Napura, you cause the workshops of Ptah to prosper. Ptah is the creator god. So what's being said here is that each of these gods, they're saying, right, the orchards of Ra are watered by you. The bread of Seb is created in part by you. The fruits of Napura are watered by you. I'm assuming the fruit trees is what that's applying to. And then even the workshops of the creator god prosper because of you. I mean, that's suggesting that the Nile god is very powerful because they're giving credit to that god for essentially all the other things the gods are able to do are because of this god. You create the grain, you bring forth the barley, assuring perpetuity to the temples. If you cease your toil and your work, then all that exists is in anguish. If the gods suffer in heaven, then the faces of men waste away. Right? So that's not a threat. That's just a recognition of the power that if you stopped providing and working, then everything would die. The torment, the flocks of Egypt were tormented and great and small are in agony, but all is changed for mankind when he comes. If he shines, the earth is joyous. Every stomach is full of rejoicing. Every spine is happy. Every jawbone crushes its food. So then it's again acknowledging what the Nile god provides. If you go down here just a little bit, he spreads himself over Egypt, filling the granaries, renewing the marts, watching over the goods of the unhappy. He is not, so this is interesting here. This is talking about probably why they don't have a statue for the Nile god. Like most of the main gods in Egypt, they have statues and figures and representations for them, and it's an animal head with a human body. But here it says, he is not sculpted in stone, and the statue is crowned with the serpent. He cannot be contemplated. No servitors has he, no bearers of offerings. He is not enticed by the incantations. None knows the place where he dwells. None discovers his retreat by the power of a written spell. So it's like the idea that nothing, no image, no idol, no representation can contain him. And that's probably in part just also because the Nile is very, very large. So it makes sense with that kind of connection. No dwelling is there which may contain you. Stable, right? There's that Mot, stability, are your decrees for Egypt before your servants of the north. Where misery existed, joy manifests itself. All beasts rejoice. Again, positive happiness, celebration. It is his force that gives existence to all things. Nothing remains hidden. Mankind desires you, supplicating you to answer their prayers. So here's another comparison between Mesopotamia and Egypt, right? So they supplicate, they pray to the Nile god. You answer them by flooding, right? The floodings of the Nile. So in the penitential prayer to every god, we never get an answer on whether the guy thinks that the gods stop the afflictions or not. It just ends. Here, they're straight up saying, people pray to you and you respond. So that's a huge difference as well, right? Men offer the fruits to you. It's just, this is just saying how beneficial it is. It is believed that with your hand of gold you make bricks of silver, but we are not nourished on lapis lazuli. Wheat alone gives vigor. So it's recognizing, right? Like gold and riches are fine, but that's not going to nourish us. Food does, and that's what you provide is more essential than any of the wealth or gold. And then it just mentions the celebration. Birds are sacrificed to you, gazelles are taken to the mountain, flames are prepared to you. Come and prosper, O Nile, come and prosper, right? Again, this, yay, it's a celebration kind of thing. So that's something that's important to, pay attention to is that recognizing the power of the Nile. So hopefully that helps as far as making sense of not only how they viewed it, but how it's different than Mesopotamia's. Okay, so that's the Nile. The next one, where are we on? Three, 4, all right. One of those numbers or letters, right? The function of the Pharaoh. What was the purpose of the Pharaoh? How did the Pharaoh work? Because there is some misconception about the Pharaoh. So I want to look at that. One of the things is, of course, I mentioned already, of course, the idea of protection and maintaining Mot, right? We talked about those. We'll just put Mot, because I guess if you're looking at any kingdom, it does vary. In the Old Kingdom, it's maintaining Mot, but Mot was their responsibility. And then protection of the land, fertility of the land, that type of stuff. But the other thing that's a misconception is that that the Pharaoh was a god, and that's not exactly true. What would we put for that? Let's see. We'll say here. We'll put this. So the Pharaoh is in a state of becoming divine. Okay? So the Pharaoh is not technically a god. Instead, it's the belief that there were two bodies. The Pharaoh had two bodies, right? And one was the human body, and one was divine. And the divine one was essentially activated with their coronation when they were crowned. And then that's when they become in a state of becoming divine. Okay, so once they get crowned Pharaoh, then now they're in this trans state, if you will, to that. So what what's the transition? How do they become fully divine? Right? What is it that takes it to be that? It's death. With their death, then they become divine. And this is why this matters, right? Because this is, this seems slightly nitpicky, and I get that when you're saying, well, they're not technically a god, they're just partially a god, they're becoming a god. It matters because it explains why the pyramid, it said divine, so I wrote it, and the afterlife. It explains why the pyramids and the afterlife were so important, right? There was an obsession with death and the afterlife and the pyramids in Egypt, especially in the Old Kingdom, but throughout. And part of that reason that there is such that focus is because the only way for the Pharaoh to get an afterlife was, and to become fully divine in death, was to be able to get to the afterlife. And you needed the pyramid to do that. The pyramids were central to, we'll put this as D. This will move into other stuff with this. But the pyramids were central to the afterlife. You needed a few things in order to get there. The first were incantations and spells. You could not make it, even as Pharaoh, who is in a state of becoming divine and gets to become divine when he dies, you have to get to the afterlife with the gods to do so. This is why only the Pharaoh is going to get an afterlife at the beginning. You have to have the pyramids. You have to have these incantations and spells, and there's way too many of them to memorize. So they actually put them on the pyramid, and then the Ba or Ka of the Pharaoh, which this is the spirit, the Ba and Ka. There's multiple parts. The other one's the Ach, that's the combination, reads the spells. And then this allows the transformation. But on top of that, you also, the afterlife is a continuation of the current one. So of course, if it's a continuation of the current life, you're going to want your stuff with you, which is why there's so much stuff in the pyramids and tombs, because that's what they want to take. Real stuff is better, right? But if you can't have real stuff or real people, let's say your wife is not dead, they didn't kill her, or they didn't kill their servants, then they would have pictures that the incantations and spells would be able to bring to life. So all of that was central to becoming a god, and it was necessary. So it's not surprising then that this became such a central focus in there, because it was really, Egypt was really centered on the Pharaoh in every possible way, and then even more so in the Old Kingdom. Now, what comes with this and what's structured around this is this bureaucratic system. So I made that pyramids there. We'll just put it as a separate one here. The bureaucracy, bureaucratic system, and pyramid building. Okay, so how this worked, because essentially you started a pyramid as soon as the Pharaoh was coronated, because it could take up to 20 years to build. And you didn't want to skimp on that, nor did you want, it really was unfortunate if the Pharaoh died before you finished their pyramid. Technically King Tut's tomb wasn't finished, and they just kind of threw some things together, shoved it in, and was like, good luck. Hopefully you have enough crap to make it to the afterlife, but who knows? Well, because there was a lot of rules and rituals to this process. And so there was a whole system behind this. And I mean, Egypt in itself, right, if you think about a bureaucracy, it was a massive bureaucracy out of necessity. Egypt was huge. You had to have a bureaucratic system behind it to work, to have a whole bunch of scribes and administrators running the things. The Pharaoh was not doing the day-to-day work. They just weren't. In fact, here's a huge difference from Mesopotamia and Egypt as well. The Pharaoh was not even expected to be seen. And they certainly weren't going around talking to their people. And that was the administrator's job to do. One of the other aspects of why it was so bureaucratic in nature is because it was a redistributive society. And a redistributive society is this idea that when money comes in or goes out into the people or to the state, it gets redistributed back to the people. And so how that worked is that you had taxation. And there were a couple different ways for taxes. One was a percentage of crop production. And then another option was to pay taxes in money. And then the last way was work or labor, right? Almost anyone that farmed had to pay a percentage of crop. If you were wealthy enough, you paid taxes in money, and then people were supposed to pay a percentage of their taxes in labor. If you were wealthy, you paid more money to get out of that. If you weren't, then you did labor. And this is how the pyramids were built. So the misconception is that the pyramids were built by slaves. They were not. They were built by other Egyptians. And it was tax-imposed labor. So if you were going to try to connect it to slavery in any way, you could say it was technically forced labor for a month that if you couldn't pay to get out of, you had to do. So temporary slavery, but even then you get paid for it. So temporary indentured servitude. That's probably the best way for it. It was not by slaves. It was by other Egyptian citizens. And there was a purpose to this of not only getting the construction built on the pyramids or temples or other things like that, mostly the pyramids. But if they didn't happen to have one that year, they would have them work on temples or roads or whatever the state, specifically the Pharaoh, needed. But the majority of the time, I guarantee you, they were working on the pyramids because those took forever. So what you would do with this is, here, we'll put it here. Pyramid structure, right? The work labor went into that. And then they would select people in cohorts, basically, based on farming, type? So specifically to avoid, if you were harvesting, you wouldn't be selected in the group that was working that time. You worked 1 to 2 months a year. And they specifically picked, right, your downtime, when it was going to be leaner, when you were when you weren't going to have work, when you actually were probably less likely to have the food or resources that you needed. And then you went and worked with your cohort and you helped build whatever. And there were various jobs, right? There wasn't just one job for the pyramid. There was the manual labor, but there were architects, there were designers, there was a whole bunch of different things. So your skill level did play a part in what type of job you did. It also played a part in how you got paid, or how much, not how much you got paid. And so then they had whole, essentially pyramid working towns that were created for the workers. And then they got paid in bread and beer, but not beer like we think of it today. It had some alcoholic content, but it was gruel. Think of it like as a watery oatmeal substance. It was nutritious, and that was the purpose. If you wanted to drink, you drank wine. If you wanted a nutritious drink that was going to be safe because it had an alcoholic content and killed any bacteria, beer was the way to go. I feel like drink slurp because I'm not sure how much you're drinking that, but it was very nutritious. And then bread. However, the thing is, they don't just pay you in in actual bread. I mean, you could get it while you were there. And they made it like this was state bread. They actually had 2 types of loaf pants. And this shows you how bureaucratic ridiculousness it was for this, is that they measured everything. So that I guess they made sure they didn't waste it, that people weren't stealing. They would measure the ingredients beforehand. And these were all made by workers with the percent. Oh, and by the way, if we go back up here for a second, I'm going to scroll it down for just a second. Percentage of crop production went into where they had the goods to make the bread, right? So it's clever in that sense of this is the redistributive part of it. You take from the people for taxes, and then you use that to produce the bread that you're going to pay the people in. And they measured those ingredients before, and then they measured the loaves of bread, of each loaf of bread. And then they measured any waste, and they recorded all of this. To make sure that that wasn't probably being stolen, but also like they knew input and output percentages. So they were very anal about keeping records of everything in that sense. And then you got paid in that, okay? And let's put here C. Most of the time, though, you didn't take that because that wouldn't do you much good. They actually did feed you, too. Like, you weren't just getting fed bread and beer. That would be unfortunate. They fed you, but then you had this bread and beer. And some people probably took some of it while they were there, but then the rest, you wouldn't just pile up in the corner of your room for a month to 2 months. It would go bad. And then what's the point of that? Instead, what they gave were essentially ration tickets. And it was based on what you were paid and what you were owed in bread and beer. And then you could take these home and use these in lean times to purchase at state granaries, right? Or to sell for other goods with your local neighbors. And in this way, it provided for the people in lean times. I mean, it was really smart in that sense. Okay, so that's how they got the pyramids built, and you had this bureaucratic system. Now let's look at the pyramids themselves and what type. Now remember in so like I said, we're still on pyramids. There's a lot with the pyramids, and because again, this is key with this. The Pharaoh had ultimate power and control. The Pharaoh owned everything. And technically owned Egypt. So we'll put Pharaoh here too. Everything was the Pharaoh's property. You just borrowed it. He was just gracious enough. There was no expectation of direct involvement. And then you had the entire religious structure, right, was centered around the Pharaoh. So the political power was the Pharaoh. You had the administrative bureaucratic system, but the Pharaoh was in charge of everything. And then the religious structure was around the Pharaoh. The afterlife, it was not only a continuation of the current one, but it was only for in the Old Kingdom, it was only for the Pharaoh and family. And it may be occasionally a trusted vizier, right? Because the pyramids were needed. And that was essential to getting to the afterlife with those incantations and spells. And really, most of the literature was also centered around the Pharaoh, because most of the most of the Old Kingdom literature were incantations and spells. We saw the hymn to the Nile, and we'll look at instructions of Ptahhotep, but those are some of the unique ones. A ton of Old Kingdom literature is centered around getting the Pharaoh to the afterlife in what is the pyramid text. Oh, I'll look at PowerPoint in just a second. There were 3 stages of the pyramids. Okay, So you had the first was actually a mastaba, which these were seen as the tombs. So and this is definitely pre-Old Kingdom. Before the Old Kingdom, if here is the ground, they built these tombs, and this was a mastaba. And that was what was above there. And then you had the chamber that went down into the rooms. And there could be more than one room. I'm just going to draw one. Then King Menes, this is at the start of the Old Kingdom, you have the step pyramid. And in the step pyramid, King Menes asked Imhotep, who is an architect, who is also featured in the movie The Mummy, but they have him as like a magician. He actually was a musician. I can't say it now. He was a musician as well as a magician. Too many M words. He was an architect. He was a poet. He was a musician. I'm just going to stop trying to say that word. He was a magician. He was not a magician. He got converted to in Hollywood as a magician. But he was all these other things. And he was really talented. He was one of the few people in Egypt where we actually see him moving up in status in social class. Because again, most people, it was you were put on, you had your place in your world because that's where the gods wanted you to be. But he was so talented, he actually got moved up to head architect for the Pharaoh at the beginning of unified Egypt. And so the Pharaoh said, hey, Imhotep, we have this mastaba. That's great. But like, I'm now Pharaoh of unified Egypt. And all these other kings before me had these mastabas. That's no fun. I want something bigger and better. So just design me something better. So Imhotep took the mastaba and added more smaller mastabas on top of it. And that got you the step pyramid. And then of course from there, right, that's not a long shot from how the step pyramid moves to the regular pyramid, right? I mean, that's not, it's easy to see the structure in the step pyramid that they just expanded from there. And that you do see way more tunnels. Again, it wasn't just one in the other kingdoms and stuff, or in the other iterations. But I wasn't going to draw a bunch. But it definitely gets more elaborate, and this sometimes could go up into here as well. So you could have underground, and then you could have tunnels like this into it. So those are the iterations of it. So let's look at that. And let me talk about mummification real quick too. Right, so with this, mummification was seen as an important part of getting to the afterlife as well. And that was also reserved for the Pharaoh and his family. Because again, the belief was that you ultimately are more likely to, you want the real thing. So you want to preserve the body. And you need the pyramid with the incantations and spells and your body. And then any real stuff that you can put in there, you do. Anything you can't, like they weren't going to put in cattle and live things that were going to rot. But of course you want your servants, and you want food, and you want activities, and you want animals. I mean, it's why they mummified their pets when they died, because they wanted them to come to the afterlife. But anything that you couldn't physically put in there that was real, which was the best option, you then put images and paintings that you said the incantations and spells to, and it brought at least a representation of that with you to the afterlife. And then anything that was real that you could throw in, including your body, which you preserved as best as possible so that that could go to the afterlife with you, you put into the pyramid. So let's look at these examples here. Here's showing like the whole process of mummification was reserved for the Pharaoh and his family. It was all about preserving the body for the afterlife. Here's Imhotep. There's the mummy's version of Imhotep, but he was actually a real person. In the movie The Mummy, they like kind of placed him through all the kingdoms and even the new. He was at the very beginning he was actually technically pre-dynastic, and then they're at the beginning of the old. So here's the step pyramid, right? You can see the mastaba. and it's just mastabas put on top of each other and then expanded out. And then and here's where you can see this right here. This is the remnants of what would have been the workers area, right? So they would have created these kind of housing areas because they were 20 plus years to build this. You can build some pretty permanent settlements and be all good to go. And then you also had to have the priest area, because the priests were the ones that did all of the pyramid text and art, right? They were the ones that had to take care of that. And in fact, the art in, I think I just showed the text in this. These are the actual pyramids. I'll show you the text. We'll talk about that in just a second, right? These are the pyramids of Giza. One of the things, they kind of look like step pyramids here. They're not. They just were, the stones, so many stones have been stolen. It ends up looking like a step pyramid. But do you see this area here? It's a little bit remnant left. Once the pyramids were done, they actually, the outer layer was limestone. So it's muddied there in that picture because of course it's thousands of years old. But it would have looked white when it was first finished. And so you would have had this thing, imagine like the pyramids, like with the sun hitting off of that, it would have just been shining so bright. And then they often topped the top part with gold sometimes as well. So you would have had this shining beacon of, woo, I'm here, wah. It definitely is like this, you know, look at me kind of thing. And the kings definitely, the pharaohs definitely competed. This was about status as well. Don't mistake that this wasn't about status. Each pharaoh, after created the first step pyramid, tried to create a bigger and bigger pyramid. They finally stopped that when one of the pharaohs was like, I need mine bigger. And so the architect started going and he was making the biggest pyramid that was out there to date. And then they realized that if they didn't stop, it was going to collapse. So they had to make this little indentation and make a little point like that. So the pyramid kind of looks stupid. And then they stopped trying to compete and make it bigger. Then they decided, oh, there's our threshold. We're not going past that. I'm sure that king was not particularly pleased. That pharaoh was not particularly pleased with them. But so yeah, you wanted each pharaoh, subsequent pharaoh, wanted a bigger pyramid because it not only was for your afterlife, it was also a symbol of power. Because it was this large physical object that everyone could see and was shiny. As well, and so it definitely, and it was indicative of your wealth and your power. For a look at how big of a pyramid, right, that I was able to have constructed. This shows how strong and powerful I am in that process. And then here's pyramid text. So this is just the text, but again, if you needed, like, there were lots of pictures that went with it too. So you'd have pictures, and there were some I had to do with extra credit with the coloring. Those are from the pyramids and tombs. And there was images of everyday life, of people, of animals and things that you would need, right? And then those had to go in there. And one of the things that's interesting with this is that the style, and I don't have one here to show, but I think I'm going to put up the art in Egypt lecture that's just as a bonus lecture again, and it talks about it a little bit more. But you know, there was a specific style of how the Egyptians were, and there were different poses. Ooh, I'll put that up. I have that sheet that shows the poses. There's my Egyptian. So they had different poses. This was actually gridded out and systematically done so that every single one looked the same, and they had different poses to represent different things. So they didn't just randomly, you didn't have some priest that was just like, I'm going to do abstract guy, and you're like, that's supposed to be a bull, a person, a dog. No, it was super consistent, and there were all these rules to it because the goal was that if no matter what priest started a drawing, any other priest could pick up and finish, and you wouldn't ever be able to tell the difference. And because then there were different poses to represent different things, it was very systematic and organic, or not organic, non-organic, because the whole idea was it was for the religion. It was for the afterlife. It was for the incantations and spells. The majority of art, here we can put that real quick on here too, right? The majority of art was for the pharaoh. So we'll do 5 here, right? What all this stuff with the pyramids and Pharaoh. Art for the pyramids done by the priest. So you don't have diversity until the New Kingdom when they move away from that. The art was for the Pharaoh. The literature was for the Pharaoh. Right? Pyramids, this was the other thing I said. As symbol of power and status. Okay, but the literature, the art, the day-to-day life and how the government functioned, everything was centered around Pharaoh. That's the key with what I want to emphasize with that. But again, this grid-like structure was so that anyone could pick it up and repeat it. The rigid structure, the rigid rules of how they did their art was for that. And there was very little art outside. I'm sure there was some individual Egyptian that painted in their house, but what was preserved, what was done for public art as well as private art was either for the Pharaoh in the palace or was for within his pyramid. And then there wasn't much diversity outside of that. So that's kind of the key of like, what's the main characteristic of the Old Kingdom? The fact that the Pharaoh was all powerful and owned everything, and that the religion, literature, politics, and art was all for the Pharaoh and his afterlife. The last one then, the precepts of Ptahhotep, or the instructions of Ptahhotep. It can be either way. I just want to look at a couple of these. If hopefully you get a sense when you read through these, this idea of moderation, everything in moderation. And think about with Mott and that list, and go back to the list of Mott and try to like look at kind of different sentences in these, and does it fit somewhere in that? Because these were meant to be public, even though it was supposed to be a letter for a son. The vizier put it in stone. I mean, you're not, and put it out of his burial area that he got from the Pharaoh. You're clearly not saying, I'm keeping this private just for my family. You're like, please read. I obviously have something important to say, and I want everyone else to know it. That's what that's saying here. And these were things to live by, and the Egyptians seem to follow, right? It isn't just like, oh, might be. No, the Egyptians seem to follow the philosophy of Mott and how they chose to live and what the values that they saw were important. If you find a dispute while he is hot and he is superior to you in ability, lower your hands, bend the back, do not get in a passion with him. Again, it's that balance, right? So the idea is that this dispute, if someone's mad at you and they're leaning forward, yelling at you, you put your hands behind your back and you lean back, you're balancing their reaction. They move forward, you move back. But then it even says, it's utterly wrong to interrupt him, and that proclaims you are incapable of keeping yourself calm when you are contradicted. Again, this idea of calm, even keel is the word I think of when I read the instructions of Ptahhotep. You're supposed to just be even keel in everything you kind of do, which is also a balance in of itself. The better of the two is he who is impassive. Again, impassive, even keel. Be not angry, and then if you find a dispute while he is hot, do not despise him because you are not of the same opinion. Be not angry against him when he is wrong. Away with such a thing. He fights against himself. Do not amuse yourself with the spectacle which you have before you. It is odious, it is mean. It is part of a despicable soul so to do. So not only is it saying, don't get angry at the person if they don't agree with you, but don't sit there and enjoy them being all upset either. That's detrimental to your soul as well, to be making fun of someone, to mocking a situation where someone is angry. Then here's one talking about justice, right? That's one of the things with, so we could say balance here, right? Justice. To throw obstacles in the way of laws is to open the way before violence. Shall that which is below gain the upper hand, if the unjust does not attain to the place of justice? Throw things in the way of the law, that's like trying to block the law or circumvent the law, right? No, justice is more important. If you are among the persons seated at meat in the house of a greater man than you, take which he gives you, bowing to the ground. Regard that which is placed before you. Right, that's know your place. The idea of place in the world. If you are a farmer, this one's also place in the world. If you are a farmer, gather the crops in the field which the great Ptah has given you, right? The gods gave you.
this. Do not boast in the house of your neighbors, right? It's better to make oneself dreaded by one's deeds. So again, it's kind of that idea of the gods gave you what you have. Don't boast to your neighbors about how your stuff is better. If you are a leader of peace, listen to the discourse of the petitioner. And it talks just about how you should respond if someone's talking and petitioning you. The way to obtain a clear explanation is to listen with kindness, right? So leader of peace, right? It's talking about listening though a lot, not talking a lot. Being kind. This is also it's this idea of treating people of lower class from you well. That was a huge thing with Egypt, right? In Mesopotamia, we saw like that if you were a lower class, the Hammurabi law codes, you got a raw deal. You got harsher punishments. But here in Egypt, it was very much treat the people of lower class with respect and kindness. It almost that if you were of a higher class, you had an obligation to treat them well because everyone has been put in that place for a reason. Do not be irritable of temper. Grumble not over your own affairs. It's wrong to get into a passion with one's neighbor. Right? So again, even keel and moderate. Don't get all grumbly and irritable. Do not repeat the extravagance of language. I like this. Do not listen to it. It is a thing which has escaped from a hasty mouth. Don't talk a lot. Right? It's basically saying, you need to listen. You should be listening more than you should talk. If you are annoyed at a thing, if you are tormented by someone who is acting within his right, get out of his sight. Remember him no more when he has ceased to address you. So again, it's this kind of avoid conflict. Leave. If someone's pissing you off, just leave and stop thinking about it rather than letting it get to you and mess with your inner well-being. Be cheerful. Be happy. Let your thoughts be abundant, but let your mouth be under restraint. And you shall argue with the great. Twice good is that which issues from his... it's the idea that it's don't talk a lot. And then when you do talk, then people will think whatever's coming out of your mouth will be extra relevant than the person who constantly talks and is meaningless. Okay, so that's just those again a few additional examples. I would just go through and try to find those examples and then fit in with that definition of Mot that I gave you and say, where do you see that? Where does this reflect Mot? Because it does. How they lived, because Mot was so central to everything they did, and then that was all central to the Pharaoh. We know that there was a lot of emphasis on living your life through Mot. That was the most important, because the list that I gave for Mot was kind of like, those were the values of the Old Kingdom society, especially the Old Kingdom. In the Middle Kingdom too, but there is some anxiety of it leaving because of the first intermediate period. Here they don't have that anxiety yet. Life is good. Things are good. So much so, like the Pharaoh was the only one in his family to have the afterlife. We don't see any evidence that the lower classes were unhappy that they didn't have an afterlife. They're going to become unhappy in the Middle Kingdom and then push for an afterlife. Sorry, my dog just started going crazy. But they seem perfectly content to not have that afterlife when Mot is maintained and things are good. It's only once that disruption happens that kind of breaks some things and there's readjustment. Okay, so that's the Old Kingdom. Our next lecture, we will look at the Middle Kingdom and then the New.